notably subdued address to the United Nations General Assembly, a notably nationalistic address in which the president touted the U.S. as the most powerful country in the world, directly confronted China, talked about other key issues as it relates to international relations like Iran, like North Korea, the president making his case in front of this coalition of allies, in some instances, adversaries in the other. Again, rather muted from President Trump here in what is a closely watched speech around the world. I want to bring in Kristen Welker, who's at the United Nations General Assembly, NBC's Carol Lee, MSNBC diplomacy contributor, Ambassador Christopher Hill, former Assistant Secretary of State, MSNBC national security analyst Evelyn Farkas, Shibli Talami, senior fellow in the Sabin Center for Middle East Policy and former advisor to the U.S. missions to the United Nations, and MSNBC senior foreign affairs analyst Brett McGurk, former special presidential envoy to the global coalition to defeat ISIS, some of the smartest analysts and leading contributors around the country. Kristen, let me briefly start with you and your takeaways from what we heard from the president and reaction in the room. It seemed from the reporting that there were some murmurs when the president talked about the U.S. as the most powerful country. He said the future does not belong to globalists, which appears to be an encapsulation of the president's philosophy moving forward as it relates to America first.
That's right. This was doubling, tripling down on his America First foreign policy. Some murmurs in the room when he talked about that. As you noted, Hallie, this was a pretty subdued speech. So the reaction from the audience was largely subdued as well, although worth noting that the Venezuelan delegation did have a reaction when the president called for other countries to get tougher on Venezuela. Among the top lines for me, certainly his comments on Iran, President Trump reiterating that the United States will not lift sanctions as long as Iran continues its malign behavior. The president accusing Iran of continuing to engage in wars, as well as continuing to essentially foment anti-Semitism. He said the United States is not going to tolerate it. Not altogether surprising. He talked about the fact that the U.S. just imposed new sanctions against Iran, but Hallie also said he was open to friendship, so really leaving the door open to diplomacy. Let me toss it back to you.
Kristen Welker, thank you. Carol Lee, it is, I think, fair to call this speech a languid one from President Trump, even as he delivered warnings very directly to some of the people that he wanted to deliver warnings to, including, by the way, migrants looking to cross the border. The president extremely directly telling them, do not come to the U.S.
Yeah, he was really aggressive about that. And if you look at the speech overall, he was very aggressive on the three things that are sort of most front and center for him in terms of his campaign, setting aside the Ukraine controversy, Iran, China and trade, and the migrant crisis. And
no surprise that trade was his first point out of the gate here. And a direct confrontation with China sitting in the room.
He spent a lot of time on China. He spent a lot of time on Iran. He spent a lot of time on the border. And on China, he not only went after them on trade, but also on Hong Kong, which we haven't heard the president speak a ton about. And he basically said, he said, quote, he will say a great deal, how they respond will say a great deal about how China's role is in the world in the future. And he specifically called out President Xi. On Iran,
in language we haven't heard from him before.
Yeah, and on Iran, he talked a lot about what Iran has been doing and that they'll keep the sanctions on, but he offered no sense of how he's going to respond to the strike on Saudi Arabia's oil facility. So that's still a big open question.
Evelyn Farkas, you made the point broadly that this felt to you more like a State of the Union speech, frankly, than a UN General Assembly, given how nationalistic President Trump seemed here.
Right. Hallie, you've been reading my tweets. Yes, it sounded to me like a State of the Union address, which was completely inappropriate for this audience. Not the first time the president's done this, but that plus the America First, and he confused so many things. He doesn't know what a state is versus a nation. He says if you love your nation, you'll have peace. Actually, it's if you love your state, because nations can be ethnically divided, religiously defined. It's very different from what America is. So the message, I think, was really negative. It was either, just like a State of the Union, as I said, or just slamming everyone else and putting America first.
Ambassador Hill, I want to get to you and your reaction to what we've heard now, because as all of this is happening, of course, that shadow of Ukraine and that phone call with the Ukrainian leader back in July is still hanging over President Trump. Did he do a good enough job working to sort of change the subject here? Do you think his focus on issues like Iran is going to be effective with the allies that he wants to build a coalition with in the room?
No, I don't think he changed the dialogue at all. And frankly, the whole speech, and I like your use of the word languid. That's about how I would describe it. It was almost like one of these statements people have to read who are being captured by, terrorists or something. He just kind of went through it. His eyes were almost weirdly closed as he did it. And I don't think he offered any kind of programmatic way forward. The litany against China included a lot of insults against China. That was not nice to see. And frankly, he seemed to equate Middle East terrorism with Iran. And frankly, as we know about Sunni terrorism, it's a far more complex issue than that. And then he went through a bunch of issues, some of which seemed to be, efforts by Ivanka to put stuff in the speech. So, first of all, I'm not even sure he read it before he read it before he actually delivered it. And secondly, I just don't think there's a lot to work there with. And I think the Chinese and others probably just looked at their calendar again and said, okay, 13 more months of this guy. So I really don't think it was a very good use of his time or, frankly, the UN General Assembly's.
Let me go to you, Shili Talhami here, because the president also addressed issues that are of the utmost importance in the Middle East. He didn't talk much about his Mideast peace plan, which I think is notable, given that he has come under some fire for seeming to move away from that. But he did, as the ambassador has noted, and I know that you picked up on, discuss a lot about Iran, keeping the door open to potential diplomacy. But we know the president is not planning to meet and has said he's not planning to meet with the Iranian leader while he's here, although, again, he's not ruling that out either.
I think obviously he's given the speech at the UN, but it's really intended for the American people. That's the only way to read it. All the themes are really his campaign themes: the anti-globalism, the anti-socialism, the anti-bureaucracy, the anti-media, the anti-academics. But even on Iran, it's really an American audience because he has put himself on a slippery slope toward a war he doesn't want. And the American people don't want. In fact, I'm about to release a poll that shows over 75% of the American people, including a majority of Republicans, don't want war with Iran, even after the attack on the Saudi oil field, and shows also that he has higher disapproval ratings in his handling of Iran, including among Republicans after that attack. So you have a situation where he's sounding tough on Iran, but obviously holding an olive branch. And I think in the end, given that the Iranians understand him, they're trying to give him what he wants, which is something where he can best Obama, particularly on the nuclear deal, at the same time, a way to avert war. That's where the American public is. I think that's what we should expect in the coming weeks, despite of what he said.
To highlight that point, let me remind folks what the president had to say about Iran in the UN General Assembly speech we just listened to. Watch.
In response to Iran's recent attack on Saudi Arabian oil facilities, we just imposed the highest level of sanctions on Iran's central bank and sovereign wealth fund. As long as Iran's menacing behavior continues, sanctions will not be lifted.
Brett McGurk, let me go to you on this. This is a region you know well, in particular the fight against terror in places like Afghanistan. The president addressed, as we expected, what he describes as his work with a coalition of Afghan partners here. But clearly, this is an issue that the president has had trouble getting his arms around so far in his presidency, not helped by those talks at Camp David that he had set up with the Taliban that were ultimately scrapped.
You know, Hallie, look, if I grade the president on a curve here, the speech was fine. I was at the last two UN General Assemblies. The first speech, he talked about a rocket man on a suicide mission, and we might have to totally destroy North Korea. Last year, he got laughed at by the chamber when he tried to say he was the most successful president. So this kind of had all the standard fare. So this is the bar that the president doesn't get laughed at the General Assembly? Well, I think it is a pretty low bar. I mean, even this paradigm between globalism and patriotism is something he's used before. And I just have to tell you as a diplomat how that sounds to other countries. That's how Xi Jinping speaks about China. That's how Putin speaks about Russia. And little smaller countries ask us as diplomats, what is Trump talking about? Do we really want to unleash the forces of nationalism around the world, given where that can lead? But the truth is that our foreign policy is a bit of a mess. We have all these grand objectives with no real coherence about how we're going to achieve them. But Iran really is key, because I agree that we are on a trajectory for a conflict with Iran. I don't think Trump understands this. He thinks Iran is like North Korea. We can threaten them and they'll come back to the table. And that is not the course that he is on right now. He's in a real corner.
Thank you for checking out our YouTube channel. why don't you subscribe? It's really easy. Just click on that button down there. And for more news from MSNBC, click on any of these videos here for the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more videos from MSNBC with our newsletters. Head over to msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up.